Now on this particular example, we have another bird, but what I'm going to do is show you how to get started using acrylic paint. Now remember, when you are working on your tessellations, you can choose what medium you use, what combination of media you use, exactly what colors, all of that stuff is completely up to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a brush that has a decent size to it but is not too awfully large, because what I'm going to be starting on is, of course, the background spaces of my birds. So I'm just going to dip my brush in my paint. Remember, with acrylic paint, you do not need to use water. And I'm just going to start kind of along the edge here. And again, I'm going to turn my brush and turn my paper so that the tip of the brush is sort of along the edge of each shape that I am working on. I'm going to keep it nice and smooth. Now, one thing you will notice when you are working with acrylic paint, especially on a shape like this, you're probably going to need 2 coats or 2 layers of paint just to make sure that your color goes on as smoothly as possible, since there are so many times where we change directions with the brush. It's going to be hard to make it all smooth in one layer, so the best thing to do is just make each layer as smooth as you can, and then smooth out those little discrepancies in color and pressure with the second layer. So it's okay if some of those brush strokes are showing in the first layer. The main thing to avoid with that first layer is putting the paint on so thickly that it's globby. Your best bet is going to be to have thin layers, smooth as you can make them, and have some of those brush strokes and some bits of the paper showing in that first layer, so that then your second layer, which you will also do smoothly and thinly, you can go over the first layer without any unwanted texture or bumps and just focus on smoothing out the paint. Now, if I were you, I would go ahead and do both layers as you are working, if that makes any sense. So like, for instance, I would do the first layer on this bird, and then the first layer on another bird's larger area, and then go back to doing a second layer on this part before I do the eye or the beak. Because what you do not want to do is do the eye or the beak with that first layer before you finish with the larger part of the bird, because then you're going to mess up what you've just done. What you want to do is get all of that sort of background painting done in both layers before you go in with the detail of the eye and the beak. Now keep in mind, you can definitely use more than one brush. If you need an even smaller brush in here for some of these spaces, that's totally fine. And remember too, it will be okay if you paint over some of your pencil lines, especially if you have tracing paper that you used originally, because you can redraw lines if you need. Like if I were to paint over some of that eye, I wouldn't worry too much about it because I've got my tracing paper still, and the graphite will show up on top of the paint. So I could always redraw part of my design if I need to, like if I do paint over part of it by accident. So now what I would do would be going ahead and starting on a larger section of one of the other birds. So like, for instance, I may do a pattern of sorts to where they go diagonally. I could do, this next one over here, just kind of random. I'm going to actually do more of a bit of a random pattern on here. I do not want this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. I do not want one of the ones touching this one to be the same color, because then those colors are going to blend together. So what I'm going to do is just find one that's not touching that color, and I'm just going to start on sort of the larger space of that bird. Because then by the time I finish with my first layer over here, then my first bird will be ready for its second layer. Because acrylic paint does dry pretty fast. And once again, remember, if you want to use watercolor paint, you can. If you want to use colored pencil, you can. If you want to use marker, you can. If you want to use acrylic paint like how I am doing, you can. If you want to use a combination of media, you absolutely can. That's one of the fun things about this project, is that you really do get to pick and choose what you work with. And if you want to try something new, it's a good project to try something new on, because it's relatively simple in terms of technique. There's a lot of steps to the technique, but it's not a very difficult type of technique because you are tracing, you are using a stencil, the shapes are relatively simple. So there's that particular shape with its first coat. So now this one's almost dry enough to go ahead and do the second coat on it. It's not quite there yet. So what I would do would be to go ahead and just find another bird that I want to do the larger spot on with that sort of blue color. Maybe this little bit of one here. And again, you can use a smaller brush. I probably technically should be using a smaller brush on this part. So now I'm going to go ahead and do a second coat on this particular bird. It's mostly dry now. And I find that on your second coat, it is helpful to sort of go the other direction a little bit. So now I'm going this way, where I originally went this way. There are going to be times, of course, where you have to go in the same direction so that you keep your brush at the right angle to use it on the edge, like how I am now. But it can be very helpful, like I was saying, to just kind of go the other direction whenever you can. Just like with shading. Because what that's going to do is just cover up some of those little discrepancies. And it's going to help make things even smoother. And remember, if you are using paint, just be patient. The last thing that you want to do is rush your project. Because what that's going to do is make the quality much, much less. It's going to make your craftsmanship less. And it's ultimately going to make your overall performance and the reflected grade less than what it should be. So here, once again, I'm just doing my second coat, going the opposite direction I did originally as much as I can. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you are working with acrylic paint is that there may even be some places where you need a third coat. You may not need a third coat over the entire shape or object, but you'll see that there are some places where the brush strokes are a little bit more prominent, and you may want to cover those up a little bit more with a third coat after everything dries again. So now that bird has had 2 coats on it, and you'll see that there are still a couple of areas where I would probably want to go in with a third coat once it is dry. but I would let that color dry completely before I go in with any sort of a third coat. And I would want to let that color dry completely before I go on the beak or the eyes. So what I would do now would be go ahead and anywhere else where I still have that blue, go ahead and start on my second layer there. So again, just kind of going in the opposite direction that I did originally as much as possible. And one thing to pay attention to as well when working with acrylic paint is just the fact that the paint does typically dry a little bit darker. So if you are not quite happy with your color after the first layer, I would let it dry before you just naturally make it darker. Because chances are you may be happier with it once it is dry, because again, it will dry a little bit darker. So now I'm just kind of smoothing out some of those bumps. I'm going to go ahead and do a third layer with a smaller brush now on this tiny little section down here at the bottom. So using a brush that is the correct size for what you are working on is very, very important. It will greatly improve your craftsmanship, and it will make the project much, much easier. Because really, anytime you use the most accurate tools for the job is going to turn out best and be the easiest it can be. So the next video that I'm going to be showing you for this particular demo is where I'm going to start on the beak and the eyes on my main sort of demo bird here.